There are three incidences in particular that motivated me to begin an exploration of the roots of the horror genre. The first happened about a year and a half ago, when the high school that I teach at had the extreme privilege to welcome New York Times bestselling author and creator of the Repairman Jack series, F. Paul Wilson, and horror legend Tom Montiello, owner of Borderlands Press and the director of the Borderlands Press Writers Boot Camp. They were in town to work with my creative writing students and offer critique and feedback on their work, as well as share some insight into the life of a writer and the publishing industry. Now, when I have writers and editors here to work with my students, usually the night before I take them out to dinner, it's a good opportunity just to hang out and relax, especially because I don't get a chance to get out to as many cons as I'd like to, so this is a good chance for me just to talk to them and talk shop and things like that. But this is Paul Wilson and Tom Montiello. I certainly wasn't about to badger them and pester them to come hang out with me the night before the workshop. So imagine my surprise when Paul called me at home, wanted to know if I was busy and if I'd like to come hang out. Of course, I said yes. They gave me directions because they were at a friend's house, and they had told me this beforehand. They were going to come visit a friend in the area while they were doing the workshop. So I went there, and I was very quickly introduced to none other than Stuart David Schiff, former editor of Whispers magazine and the Whispers anthologies from the 70s and 80s. And I was blown away to learn that this genre giant lived here in Binghamton all this time underneath my nose, and I never knew. He took me on a tour of his basement, which was absolutely jam-packed full of all the genre memorabilia you could possibly imagine. Science fiction, fantasy, horror, sword and sorcery, golden age sci-fi, weird fiction, crime, suspense. It was all there. It was like literally a Smithsonian of the speculative genre. For the rest of the evening, I had a ringside seat while Paul and Tom and Stu reminisced in the old days, and they talked about writers and the business as it used to be and as it was now, and them growing up, what their inspirations were. And as the night went on, I began to realize that I had kind of a deficit of knowledge when it came to the roots of the genre. And there's good reason for that. I was a hodgepodge reader when I was a kid. I read whatever I could get my hands on. I lived out in the country, so there weren't really comic book stores or bookstores out there. I just read whatever I could check out of the library. And even when I came to the horror genre later in life, around age 26, 27, I liked to stick with the big three, as I call them: Stephen King, Dean Koontz, and Peter Straub. Maybe John Saul, if I was getting a little experimental. And while those are certainly fine quality writers, that was the only horror that I had read. So when Tom started talking about Fritz Leiber, and they started talking about Karl Edward Wagner and August Derleth and Robert Howard, and I started hearing these names, I started realizing, wow, these are writers I've maybe heard of before. I've never read. I really need to explore these writers. And it was a very eye-opening experience for me. The second occurrence was actually more of an academic situation. Several months ago, I was reading a nonfiction work called The Philosophy of Horror by Noel Carroll. He's an entertainment and media philosopher, and he was studying the popularity and the persistence of the horror genre. And some of the things he said were very intriguing. He tracked the development of the horror genre back to the 17th century and 18th century Gothic novel, as perhaps a knee-jerk reaction to the Age of Reason, the Age of Enlightenment, and he tracked it all the way up, through the ages. One thing he said really struck a chord with me, though, and that was that in his estimation, horror writers know they're working in what he called a shared tradition, that these writers drew upon writers of the past. They were aware of their contemporaries' writings, and they used those things to fuel them to write their own works. And I think that the biggest thing is that phrase he used, a shared tradition, which again, I realized that I knew very little of this tradition. I knew the popular authors. I was reading all the current stuff from leisure fiction, but had I really explored the roots of the genre and this tradition? I knew nothing of it. So that was another thing that really motivated me. I really need to look at this and really start exploring this. The third incident occurred this past November at a conference up in New Hampshire, Anthology 2011. We like to call it AnthoCon. It's a speculative conference put on by Shroud Publishing, which is based in New Hampshire. And our keynote speaker was best-selling author Brian Keene. And his keynote address, aptly titled Roots, was about the development of the horror genre. From its very beginnings, through all its different phases, through the ups and downs and the fluctuations of the market, all the way to the present. And he cited two really important things, I thought. The first one, again, the idea of the shared tradition that horror writers and horror readers, especially horror writers, should be aware of the past. That we should allow these writers to inform, inspire, and shape our work today. And he also mentioned a unique situation where he'd come across something on the internet where several young writers, many of them talented writers, he believed, future of the genre, were debating the importance of Robert Bloch. Will people still be reading him 20 years from now? Is he important in the genre? But then many people in this debate, readily admitted that they had not really read Robert Bloch. They were debating his importance, but they're saying, oh, I've never read any of his novels, just a back copy of the novels. And the incongruity of that struck Brian. That was very, very ironic that they were doing that. So he really felt that if we're going to be looking at the horror genre and having these conversations, that we need to be reading the past and understanding where we've come from before we can ever produce anything new. So for me as a young writer, these three experiences were really important things. They really set off some sparks in my head because I felt that, here I am trying to produce my own voice, trying to produce new works. But if I haven't read these old works, how can I possibly know what's new? If I haven't read all the other stories that have come before me, how can I possibly put my own spin on it? So that was, the foundational for this desire in me to really look back at the horror genre and start educating myself, start reading these works and these different periods of horror and trying to build up, try to take care of this deficit of knowledge that I had inside. So this is the proposal of this podcast series, and that will be to look back to the origins of the horror genre, wherever they may be, and it's going to be hard really to pick that out. What was the first horror story? So many of our myths and our legends and our folk tales they're weird and strange and scary and kind of horror-ish, and they've been passed down through oral tradition. Beowulf's one of the greatest monster-killing stories of all time, and we don't even know who the author was. It was passed down for, I think, 600 years orally before somebody actually wrote it down. So we're not really going to try to pinpoint the first horror story, but I think we want to look back. Probably a good place to start will be the 17th century, 18th century with the development of the gothic novel, and look at how the genre has evolved over the years. I think it's important to point out that what we're really after here is the stories, the themes, social commentary, if there exists as such. Because I'm going to propose that the prose is a very fluid thing. And what I mean by that is that prose changes with culture, changes with the reading culture, the literacy of a generation. And it's just something that when we're looking at works during that Gothic period, let's say perhaps someone's listening to this podcast and thinks, this Gothic novel that, Kevin was talking about, and they go and read it, and you start banging your head against the table after 3 or 4 paragraphs, this really purple prose. One thing we want to keep in mind is there's going to be a progression, a change in the prose. So when I'm talking about these works, I really think we're going to focus on the theme, the content, the message. One of the litmus tests, basic litmus test for a literary work is, does it comment on the human existence? Does it comment on what it means to be human? And a lot of these Gothic novels, I'm sure, have many things to say about fears and dreams and beliefs and nightmares and good and evil The prose may not necessarily be for everybody, though. So we want to keep that right in the forefront, to just get that out of the way. Some of the prose may be a little bit harder to deal with, and it evolves. We're really looking at the stories themselves and the themes. So, given that legends and fairy tales and folklore, especially the Brothers Grimm, anyone ever read those fairy tales? They're fairly gruesome. Given the fact that all those tales back to antiquity could be considered splinters of the horror genre, I think it's going to be best for us to start right there in that sweet spot that Noel Carroll was citing, the 17th century, the 18th century, with the Age of Reason and the Age of Enlightenment. And again, he posed some really interesting ideas that will be a great place to situate the birth of the horror genre, because during that period there was a wide dissemination of the ideas of Descartes, Bacon, Locke, Hobbes, Newton, all these ideas about science and reason, and separating it a lot from superstition and religion and things of the supernatural nature. And he was kind of throwing out those ideas, Noel Carroll was, that maybe this gothic genre developed as kind of a counter to that. If the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason is a time period that's marked by reason, science, nature, and that's it. It's ironic that the gothic fiction genre explores emotions, sometimes violent emotions, with these gothic settings that may or may not necessarily be haunted by the supernatural. So Carroll was very interested about how those two things overlap. So that may be the best place for us to start. And what I'm going to begin with, I believe, is several gothic novels. I'm going to be looking at The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. I believe I'm going to look at The Monk by Matthew Lewis, and Vathek by William Beckford. And of course, we're going to have a discussion about Anne Radcliffe, because Anne Radcliffe also worked in that Gothic tradition. In fact, she has a really nice essay where she differentiates, even back then, between terror and horror. Where she says that terror is that dread of anticipation. Don't know what's going to happen next. And it's the unseen that really inspires terror, or that where horror is the resulting emotion, whether we feel horror, a sense of revulsion at something that has happened. And that's, even reading my brief exploration of those things before I started this podcast, even that for me as a writer was very illuminating, because that right there, it splits up the horror genre into all sorts of different factions and what kind of stories that can be told. So I believe that's where we're going to start and begin, is by looking at those novels and looking at that time period. One thing we do want to keep in mind, though, like I said before, it would take a lot of research, a lot of time to look back at the Enlightenment period. And can we do it really? Can we decide, these people were reading these novels because and they were doing it as a concerted effort to rebel against the Enlightenment? We really can't do that. It's going to be very, very hard to do. What we can do, though, is slowly look at these works of literature and look at the time period they were written in and try to make some connections. For example, H.P. Lovecraft, there's a lot of people out there right now that really want to start considering him a literary writer. Again, if we go back to that definition of something that's literary as a work that makes a comment on the human experience, he was writing about the dangers of forbidden knowledge, and that there are things out there that we may not want to discover. And here he is writing in that time period where there's the Industrial Revolution, and after that, and we're pushing all these advances in science and medicine, and Lovecraft may be saying, wait, maybe we don't want to discover these things. So I think that's going to be the best thing that we can do, is to look at these works and track them, how they change over time. And there also, I believe, we're going to throw a discussion out there about how we've come to this postmodern age. I recently did a research project for graduate school on postmodern horror cinema. It's a different animal than the horror novel, but still, it's a different part of the same animal, I guess you could say. There's a difference between postmodern horror, which we could kind of consider the age that we're in now and where we came from. And when you're talking about going through the Vietnam War, going through those turbulent times, or looking at stuff during the 50s, both Noel Carroll and Stephen King had a lot to say about that in Danse Macabre, tracking the development of the horror genre against the backdrop of social climate of the time. And I think, again, these are not necessarily things like a math equation, 2 plus 2 equals 4, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So I don't want to mislead anybody and think that I'm going to be trying to offer all these pat explanations for what this time period of the horror genre reflects this climate change. It's simply an exploration of the horror genre as it's developed. And obviously, social climate, social change is going to be an impact. It's going to be an impact on those things. So what are my reasons for doing this, for sharing this all with you? One thing I've always lamented a little bit is that I feel like I've come onto the scene late in life, and I don't know what my ultimate destiny is as a writer, how that's going to work out. But I know one thing that I feel very intensely is the desire to share these things with other younger writers. When I was in high school, there was no internet. There's no way of finding out about these horror writers or anything like that. And even after I became interested in the horror genre, sure, the internet was there. There's no Facebook, there's no MySpace, there's no Twitter, forums. I just wasn't much of an internet guy myself, so I had a hard time finding answers or finding knowledge. I worked in the dark, in a vacuum. So I think probably the ultimate intention of this podcast series would be to examine the roots of the horror genre, and hopefully for young writers out there who was like I was 10 years ago, this will be kind of something information for you, so that you won't spend 10 years just reading the same 3 authors, kind of like I did. That you will get out there maybe a little bit earlier than I was able to, and I can provoke some people to think this and think that. And again, one thing we also want to keep in mind too is that we read what we want to. And that's important. I always tell that to my English students, that heaven forbid we ever stop reading for pleasure. We should always read for pleasure. And I'm going to be going through a whole list of works of literature, and I'm not saying that these works of literature are the end-all of horror fiction, that you better read all these books and you better like them, and if you don't, then you're not a true horror fan. That's obviously not true. We have different works and different tastes, and we also have different moods. There are times when we're in the mood for a really weighty, literary, thoughtful horror novel, or we're really in the mood for something fast and pulpy and vicious. So right from the very outset here, I don't want to make that mistake that I'm giving you this list of books that all you folks better read, and if you don't, then you're not true horror fans. That's not the case at all. We're just going to be exploring works that stand out over the years, and hopefully if you end up buying some of these works because I've recommended them, or reading them and tracking them down, great. Even if you read some of these things and be like, oh, this is awful, I never want to write something like this, that in itself is informational. That in itself will help push you in a certain direction. And hopefully we can keep this light, and I won't stumble over my words too much, hopefully, and that we'll have a good time and won't get too boring. And we may even, depending on what Tales of Terrify wants to do, we may even talk about maybe email suggestions or things like that. But again, hopefully our time together will be profitable, it'll be enjoyable, and also informational for everyone involved.